Right, so this is joint work with Franziska Riepel, and we look at how a citizenship reform in Germany has affected educational achievement and integration a bit more generally in the case of Germany. So let me start by motivating this with something we probably all know, that there's still very large and persistent gaps in the education and labor market outcomes between natives and immigrants. And there is some evidence that these gaps are closing a bit over time, and that also citizenship was one of the main accelerators of the closure of such pre-existing gaps. At least that's what we know from Europe, from these two papers here. Because citizenship is sometimes considered a good avenue to help closing these gaps, policymakers many times think about how can we use citizenship laws effectively to foster integration and close these gaps even further. But it's unclear, and that's pretty much the main motivation for this paper in particular, how to optimally design such a citizenship law. One key question is, for example, the timing of naturalization. When should immigrants or second-generation immigrants be allowed to obtain citizenship formally in a country? Is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? Is it 10 years? Is it never? Is it at birth? And this whole debate goes on a bit about these two concepts, which we call a catalyst or an endpoint of integration rhetoric. If you think of citizenship as an endpoint to integration, you could think about it sort of as a reward for you being able to integrate well, learn the language well, show that you're able to be economically self-sufficient, and only then you get this big privilege of having the citizenship of the country that you migrated to. And if that's a key motivator for actually integrating, that could be the view. Or otherwise, there's people who say, well, citizenship could also be a catalyst to integration, because once you get all the rights of a citizen and all the sort of the perks of being accepted in a country, integration could go a lot faster and work a lot more smoothly. So we are going to examine in this paper the catalyst effect in its most extreme form, so birthright citizenship. What is if you unconditionally, right from the start, get access to all privileges entailed by citizenship? What we are going to do a bit more concretely is to exploit a reform that took place in 2000 in Germany, and it introduced for the first time at least partial birthright citizenship, and we will evaluate that using high-quality survey data. And we will ask 3 questions in particular. The first one, how does birthright citizenship affect economic integration? And today we're going to look mainly at education, but in future work we're going to expand this a bit more and also consider labor market outcomes. And then in the second step, we will ask what channels are activated by this reform, and also who is most affected from this reform, who is benefiting most from birthright citizenship. Both of these things are going to help us identify a bit which mechanisms are at play and how we could leverage them for future policies. Right, so we're of course not the first ones to consider how citizenship can affect integration, but most of the literature is focused on naturalization instead of birthright citizenship. So when people go and apply for citizenship. There's quite a lot of evidence showing that, in fact, labor market outcomes, for example, but also savings and integration in a more socio-emotional way are fostered once people get faster or less restrictive access to citizenship. And some of these papers are also looking at that in the context of Germany and consistently find these results that I just mentioned. So these are indicated by a star. But the ones that are really focused on the birthright citizenship reform that we care about are mainly looking at very early childhood outcomes. So Abitabile, Klotz, Figuera, and Marcella look at how this introduction of birthright citizenship affected fertility of immigrant parents. And they actually found that it went down by a lot, and that parents in addition started investing much more time and money into the education and sort of well-being of their children. And this goes a bit in line with the quantity-quality trade-off in fertility by Becker, that you sort of have more high-quality children now that it's worth investing so much more time and money. Later on, looking at somewhat later life outcomes, so entry into kindergarten, entry into school, Felfereiner and Sauer look at a state in Germany that they have very good information on, and see that children that benefit from birthright citizenship actually get enrolled a bit earlier and also get into somewhat more academic secondary school tracks. What we will do is to sort of expand this paper, by looking at it for the whole of Germany, but also by expanding the time horizon and tracking the evolution of these children's outcomes until they turn around 20. And what we will do in addition is to go a bit deeper into what mechanisms are actually underlying and driving these effects. Right, all of this said, let me briefly explain what I want to talk to you about today. After this brief motivation, I want to dig a bit deeper into what the institutional background of our reform was, and disentangle what we can use for identification in our setting. Next, we will talk about the empirical strategy and the data that we use to conduct our research before digging deeper into the results. The results today, as I mentioned, are mainly about educational outcomes and performance within schools. And only in section 5, basically, we'll talk a bit more about what other potential mechanisms or soft factors can we observe, what heterogeneities do we observe, and sort of enter the discussion of what are the key drivers of the effects of birthright citizenship. Right, and then finally we will conclude, and let's see how much time we have left, but I'm happy really to talk about questions or otherwise engage with them via email. So this is still much work in progress, and any sort of comment you have is much appreciated. Right, okay, the institutional background. So in Germany, as many other countries in Europe, we tended to be very firmly tied to this principle of jus sanguinis, meaning that you basically inherited the citizenship of your parents. And if your parents weren't German nationals, it would be very hard for you to get the German nationality. In addition to that, double citizenship is traditionally discouraged in the sense that people just wanted you to be part of one country, so to say. After the Second World War, as Germany sort of recovered from all this, we had a big inflow of immigrants to Germany, mainly so-called guest workers, who, although they were intended or oftentimes intending to stay for a short time, ended up staying in big parts for a long time, but only had very, very limited access to citizenship through marriage or this sort of like not straightforward channels. There were, however, some special rules for a very specific group of immigrants, which had some sort of German origin. And those were so-called Spätaussiedler, or people who, after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, returned to Germany and sort of made use of their German origins to recover German citizenship. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there were a lot of these Spätaussiedler sort of entering the country and making use of this special rule, which sparked a debate about, well, we should make it more equitable for other people also to get citizenship. And this is how the 1991 reform, which is sort of the baseline setting in which we are working, came to be. These were the first avenues to citizenship at all. Nothing changed about the jus sanguinis, but now it was possible to naturalize after having resided in the country for at least 15 years. Even though you did have to resign your previous nationality and go through a couple of tests, for example, about economic self-sufficiency or language requirements. And this is sort of the setting into which we come 9 years later with the 2000 reform. And this reform is basically the key element in German jurisdiction that we're going to be interested in. So this reform, for the first time, significantly lowered the barriers to actually obtaining citizenship and also introduced the first ever elements of jus soli, so the law of the land, meaning that you have the possibility to be German just for having been born in the country, instead of having your parents be German nationals. Right, so this reform had 3 main elements. The first one was that the residency requirement for naturalization was lowered from 15 to 8 years. So this is basically concerning the parents of the children that we look at. The second one, and the one we care about mostly, is birthright citizenship, meaning that children born in Germany after 2000 automatically started with acquiring citizenship if their parents fulfilled some criteria. And in this specific case, they had to have resided in Germany legally for at least 8 years. I mentioned earlier that Germany used to discourage double citizenship, and in fact, it has already been documented that this discouragement of double citizenship was one key reason why very few people took up the German nationality through naturalization. But for these children, for the first time, it was possible to actually keep multiple citizenships until a certain age before they actually had to choose. So at least this dissonance between one national identity and the other was delayed by a couple of years. Just to be complete in what I explain here, there was a transitional provision. So even though this law applied mainly for children born from 2000, for 1 year, so from January to December 2000, children born in the 10 previous years had the possibility to also benefit from this new law. However, this was sparsely used because in contrast to the actual birthright citizenship, this was not automatic at all. So parents actually had to actively go and require the citizenship for their children. And it's estimated that only about 10% of eligible children use this transitional provision. Okay, so far so good. Maybe let me add that there was a very recent reform which will be enacted in June 27th, which has sort of built on this reform and made birthright citizenship even more accessible, so that parents only had to live in Germany for 5 instead of 8 years. So in a way, this research hopefully has some information entailed about how the new reform could act on integrational outcomes, and let me preview so much that these results are actually quite promising. Okay, but what is so special about birthright citizenship? We call it like the catalyst in its most extreme form. So why do we say that? In fact, it's important to point that out because even before the reform, it was quite possible for children born in Germany to get access to citizenship. If they went to school in Germany, it was always almost sure that they would get the access if they actually applied later in life. So what changed? So first of all, it became a lot less costly. So you didn't have to pay the 250 something euros that you need to pay, at least today, to apply for citizenship. You didn't have to have the long waiting times, right now something like 9 or 10 months. You didn't have to go through the emotional stress of dealing with your own dissonance maybe between two nationalities, and with having to do these tests in German. So in many dimensions, it just became a lot less costly. Secondly, parental planning might have changed. So the fact that children now had the nationality may have reduced uncertainty about the future residency, both with parents and also children, so that you now could have already anticipated and invested into the skills and maybe also the assets that you wanted, given that you would know you would stay most likely now in Germany. And finally, if we believe that human capital accumulates over time, the fact that citizenship is conferred so early, so at birth and not only through naturalization later in life, may help you to accumulate the benefits over a longer time horizon, and thus sort of exponentially affect how citizenship matters for human capital development. Right, so these are like the 3 elements which in our way make this reform so powerful. But let's now talk a bit more about how we use this reform to actually infer something about the effects of birthright citizenship. Let's start by briefly outlining the empirical strategy. So it's actually quite simple differences and differences analysis, which uses this 2000 reform and has two groups that we care about. So our treatment group, quite straightforward, the eligible second-generation immigrants, and the control groups being the children which had at least one German parent at birth. And the idea here with the control group is that every child which had at least one German parent had automatic access to the German nationality, because the jus sanguinis, so the fact that if your parent is German, you're German as well, that never change. And in that way, this gap between German nationals who are automatically German because of one German parent and people who don't get the German nationality despite having been born in Germany, is very relevant for policy, right? You don't want any difference between these two just based on the nationalities of the parents. And well, we're going to regress different outcomes, say the highest obtained degree on a treatment dummy, cohort fixed effects that account for example, also changes in the educational system affecting the treatment and control group of a single year equally. Then beta being our coefficient of interest, saying how much after the reform sort of the outcome changed differentially for the treatment group. And then we control for a bunch of things, amongst other gender, age, fixed effects at the time of the survey. And we have an idiosyncratic error term. Right. We're going to find relatively large results, as I'll show you in a minute. So we do a couple of robustness checks. So we really add an extensive set of control variables and play around a bit with alternative control groups to see whether our control group is really the best fit for this one. And finally, we also account for selection into this treatment by conducting a sibling analysis where we restrict attention to differences between children born before and after 2000 within a single family. Right. Data. So we're looking at probably quite dispersed effects in this very specific subgroup of eligible second-generation immigrants. So we need a big sample, and we turn to the microcensus as our main data source. This is basically a repeated cross-section which targets 1% of the German population. It's compulsory and asks a full questionnaire to everyone aged 15 or older. And given the years of the microcensus that we have and this requirement to answer, we focus on a 5-year bandwidth around the reform and on the ages of children between 15 and 20. So we always have an overlap in pre and post-reform cohorts at the same age. So in this microcensus is, it doesn't go so much into like deep survey questions on how do you feel. It's really like about individual characteristics, education, household composition, labor market status, etc. And has some information though on nationality and sort of the naturalization history of children, right? And we do have something like 250,000 children, out of which 7.2 actually belong to the treatment group. So that's a good number that we can work with. We complement this microcensus with 2 additional data sets, which are a bit more focused on let's call them soft or socio-emotional outcomes. One is the socioeconomic panel, which has 2 benefits. Well, these characteristics and outcomes that I just mentioned, but also the high accuracy on parents. So it makes it a lot easier to be very, very precise about who is part of the treatment and who is part of the control group. But as you see, the sample size is just a lot lower with something like 12,400 children overall. And finally, because we care so much about education, we also use the National Educational Panel study, where we're basically following a cohort of children born something like 3 years before and 3 years after the reform over time, and track how conditional on how they did in the first survey wave in 2010, they transferred or they processed through the educational system. The very big advantage here is really that the treatment group is a very high share because people with a migration background were oversampled purposefully in the study. Right, so I talked a bit about the data now. Let's start thinking into about results. Right, the first thing we did is actually to validate whether the reform has some grip. And here we're just plotting pretty much raw data on the probability of receiving German citizenship at birth. And we have our treatment and our control group, and see that there's in fact a large jump between the cohorts born before and after the reform. If you do a regression, this would be something like 66 percentage points on average over this time period. So we do actually see that the gap in the probability of having German citizenship at birth actually closes. There can be quite a bit of misreporting in these surveys still, because this variable, whether you had German citizenship at birth, may be something that people don't always know. And sometimes because we cannot 100% determine in the microcensus the duration that parents lived in Germany before they gave birth to their child, part of our treatment group may actually not be eligible. So we do our best to clean this, but the fact that we here don't have a perfect jump, even though this was a reform which pretty much worked automatically, allows us to say that the rest of our estimates are going to be some sort of lower bound on the effects of citizenship. Right. Before we talk about education, let me give you a very brief overview about the educational system in Germany. We're going to simplify this a lot because there's big differences across states and also over time. But what you need to know for today is that our secondary school system is essentially sort of classified into 3 different tracks, which range from the least academic and shortest track to the most academic track, which entails something like a total of 12 or 13 years of schooling. So the decision on which track you get assigned to after primary school, depending on the state, is either jointly yours, the teachers, or the parents. And you can transfer between these schools, and that's also quite possible. But we will mainly look at what is the highest sort of outcome, highest degree, school leaving degree that you obtained in your entire school career. Right, so Hauptschule is going to be the least academic track, and Gymnasium the most academic track. I won't go too much into details here, but let's just keep in mind that the system is probably a lot more complicated. Good. So we did some checks for the parallel trends in these highest school degrees that someone got. So here's the probability of actually graduating with the most academic school degree, Gymnasium, which then automatically also gives you access to the tertiary education system. And we see that before the reforms, the trends here are quite parallel. After the reform, you see a small jump, but then only a gradual decrease in the gap that you have between the treatment and the control group. But ex ante, you see that the control group, so children with 1 German parent, were a lot more likely to actually graduate with this very academic school leaving degree. When we run regressions on this, so in the form that I showed you earlier, we see that there's in fact a decrease in the probability of graduating with the least academic track for treated people born after the reform, and a significant increase in the probability of graduating with the most academic track. If you compare that to what we have as an unconditional pre-treatment gap, so within the cohorts before the 2000 reform, this is something like a 40% closure in the educational achievement gap between children with at least 1 German parent and children with no German parent. So focusing here on Gymnasium, which is sort of our main outcome variable, because it really is very important for how your later on educational and maybe also labor market career evolves. We see that the closure here in the unconditional gap is something like 40% again. And if you look at the conditional gaps, or after controlling for cohort fixed effects and gender, there's even about 60%. So it's quite a significant and large increase.
Sorry, Celina, I just have a question related to the previous graph. In fact, I had in mind that maybe the treatment could also have an effect on the controls. If, for example, there are more migrant waves after 2000 because of the new law, so then you can have a general equilibrium effect, for example, on the labor market, or more people in class. So maybe not the best thing for the students. And here, what I see on the right side of the graph is that the treated are not like better off after 2000. It's just that the control are a bit like stagnating. So yeah, I don't really know what is your point of view about that.
Yes, so two things. So the first one is we mainly show this graph here to talk about parallel trends. And what we do because of the structure of the microcensus is to subtract age-fixed effects at the time of the survey from this graph, which is sort of the reason why also you see such a gradual increase maybe in the beginning. But we do the same age-fixed effects for both treatment and control group. What you're saying about like the control group potentially being affected, we can't, of course, fully exclude that, but I can tell you two things. The first is that there were no strong increases in migration to Germany after this reform. Also, parents had to have lived in Germany for at least 8 years for their children to be eligible. So that would, like, the timing just wouldn't add up. But in fact, there was even a decrease in fertility for our treatment group. So in terms of how many or what percentage of treated children would have been in a school or in a classroom, we would actually sort of expect a decrease here, even though this is just a slight number. Okay, so please continue asking questions. Happy to answer. Right, what we do next.
Celina, sorry, can I just ask you something? Because the paper I have, which is, I think, an old version, the sample size is almost double. So just for me to follow, I just wanted to, if you can explain what changed in.
Yeah, I'm a little bit afraid that you might have a very old version. So the main thing that changed is that we included the year 2020 in the microcensus. So this is a whole additional year, and also a year where we have particularly many children which are aged 15 to 20. Just because of the structure and how these surveys work. If that makes sense. So
right, but the sample now is smaller, so that's why I'm asking.
The sample basically from the old version.
Yeah, which it's on your website.
Exactly. So the sample from the old version is smaller.
No, it's larger.
Okay.
It has 209,000 observations.
That's a super valid question. I know. Okay, so it has to do with how we restricted the age sort of bandwidth. We now are focusing on children between 15 and 20. And before we were saying we're looking at all outcomes at ages 15 or older. But afterwards, we realized that it would be a lot more effective to only look at this bandwidth, because that would ensure that we always have children who were born before and after the reform. The age-fixed effects would be estimated on both of these groups. So I think that's probably the reason.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay, thanks.
Okay. No, it's a super valid question, and I definitely should update the version.
Sorry, I have a question before you go to the next slide. Coming back to the plot of the trends, yeah, it seems kind of weird that the trend for the treated is kind of unmodified, or it's like on a somewhat higher level, but like most of the effect is happening here at the control group. I wonder if you could tell a story or like could justify this on like in terms of like maybe crowding out of like existing resources for education, although the control group is not as big, it's like less than 10%, right? So yeah, I wonder if you could tell a story about what's happening in the control group.
I think it's a very good it's a good point. It's, I guess, similar to also what Melchior just asked. I think so. Here, the way these regressions are run is basically on a semester level. And after these age-fixed effects, sometimes the trends are a bit weird. What we care about is how does the parallel trends that we see before change after this. So in that sense, we would be asking why do we see this change here where the gap is essentially closing. And I think one reason could also be this here, that we see that the fact in which treatment affects our treatment group, in which like how many people actually say that they have German nationality, might again this sort of slope trend be reflected in what we see here. And other than that, yeah, I don't think that there's much crowding out actually on the control group. But yeah, I'm happy to talk a bit more about this later. It's also a bit of a question on what types of graphs you show. We do care about having the age fixed effects in there, because our sample composition changes so much for the different cohorts. But yeah, let me continue maybe, and show you some additional robustness checks that we do for our main results. So here we focus on the outcome of gymnasium, so the degree that allows you to enter directly university. And we do essentially 4 things. We start by adding a lot of control variables. And in fact, our estimate becomes larger, both in absolute terms here in terms of percentage point increase, but also in how much of the conditional and unconditional treatment gap it closes. So here we add information on parental education, the state fixed effects, whether someone lives in a big or small city, and how household income. So quite a lot of different controls, which makes our sample smaller. That's why we don't do that in our main analysis, and also bias it a bit towards those children who are still living at homes where we have all this information on parents. Then we restrict the sample to those children where we can very accurately match both parents and their migration history, and again find a large and significant increase in the probability of completing the most academic track, so the gymnasium. What we do in column 3 is then to say, well, let's don't focus on the children who had at least one German parent, but, oh, sorry, this is written wrong here, but exactly one German parent. So when we look at those children who also have at least one foreign parent as a control group, we still see this large increase in the probability of attending an academic track for the children of 2 foreign parents. And the final column here, we restrict attention to families with one child born before and after 2000. And that's why the sample size goes down so much here. And then we include household fixed effects in our regression, and still see that the increase in the probability of attending an academic school track is very, very large. So something like a 1/4 to a 1/3 of the unconditional pretreatment gap. Right. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we get some suggestive evidence from the more qualitative information or more detailed information from the smaller samples from the SEP and the NEPs about the performance. In Germany, having a lower grade is actually good. So a 1 is the best and a 6 is the worst. So we do see some improvement in German grades. We also see a tendency to be more likely to target or to actually enroll in tertiary education. We're currently working on including the newest version of the microcensus to actually look at how many do actually enroll in a sample that allows us to make more precise estimations. Okay, let me use my final 5 minutes to talk about heterogeneity and potential mechanisms here. In terms of heterogeneity, we look at 3 samples or like subsamples in our population of treatment groups. The first one is to distinguish whether a child had at least one academic parent. And what we find is that, interestingly, it is the less academic households, so children with less academic parents, who benefit the most from this reform. And that's quite promising in the sense that it's usually the fact that like, for example, lower education or income levels persist over time so much, and that we now suddenly have this particularly large effect of something like automatic birthright citizenship on those children who are maybe least advantaged. Secondly, in the second column, we care about how does it matter whether one of your parents actually had a EU citizenship. And we would have expected for children with one EU parent, so to say, to have to have a smaller effect of this reform, because they already had many of the benefits probably that the German citizenship confers you in terms of freedom of travel and also access to certain positions. But we do not find a significantly smaller effect for those who had a EU citizenship parent, which is interesting and also influences a bit the interpretation of our findings. And in the final column, what we do is to look at the residency of parents. When parents lived in Germany for a long time and at least one stayed in the country for over 15 years, we find that the effect of the reform tends to be a lot or quite a bit larger. That's also promising for another reason, or interesting for another reason, because as you remember, maybe the reform didn't only entail birthright citizenship, but also a change in when parents could naturalize. And the fact that we find a positive, sort of a positive effect on this angle here is showing that our effect is not at all driven from parents now using this naturalization, but actually from birthright citizenship being conferred directly to children. Right. We also look a bit at integration outcomes. We look at how much German language is used. We also look at subjective German language skills, which tend to become a bit better. We don't want to put too much emphasis on the SEP and NEPS results because of the somewhat low sample size. But we do still find it interesting that it becomes more likely that someone is actually feeling as if they belong to Germany, or also that they would want to stay in the country in the longer term. So already sort of coming to a conclusion, let me say that we find evidence somewhat for both, that citizenship, birthright citizenship acting as a catalyst, but through two different channels. The first one is quite an economic one, so to say. Having now full and permanent access to the German labor market makes your returns to human capital potentially larger. So getting access or acquiring country-specific skills or the language, or even maybe financial assets that could help you make it easy or incentivize you to integrate more quickly and maybe also to do better in school. This is consistent with which Abitavide and all found in their earlier study about parental investment into children's human capital. However, the fact that for children of EU parents, we don't find any significantly different effects makes us think that this is really only a part of the story. It's not only just about the returns that you get from having citizenship of a country. There's also the second and quite important channel that getting birthright citizenship right from the start sends a signal of acceptance and makes it easier to sort of conciliate two different national identities, and allows second-generation immigrants to feel more identified with their host society. So it gives you more opportunities to integrate. In fact, we do document more contact with natives. In other contexts, one has shown, Heimler et al. Have shown that there's more political and social participation. And also in our case, we do find that people feel that they belong to Germany more strongly than earlier.
1 minute, Celina, by the way.
Excellent. It's still difficult to disentangle the relative importance of these two channels, but we can definitely say that both of them do play a role in the context of this birthright citizenship reform. So let me conclude just by summarizing that the educational gaps between, let's call them native Germans who had at least one German parent and the second-generation immigrants really closed significantly through this birthright citizenship reform. And in fact, the unconditional gap between these groups closes by something like 40%. And if we condition that on the cohort and parental education and gender, this closure is over 60%. Also find some evidence on improved language skills and school performance and identification with the host society. And what we hope to do in future work is to look a bit more at how all of these determinants of future labor market success actually matter for this transition between school and the labor market that is going to happen to these cohorts that are around 18 to 20 today. Good. Thank you so much for your attention and for having me again. Super happy to talk more about the paper.
Thank you, Celina, for the interesting presentation. So now we will have Teresa Freitas Monteiro. She will be the discussant for the paper. So yeah, the floor is yours. I think I made you co-host, so you should be able to. Yeah.
Yeah, can you see my slides? Okay, so I am discussing an apparently much older version of the paper, but that was the paper I had. So sorry, but yeah. Uh, so yeah, just general comments. I think the paper is very clear about who is affected by this change in citizenship rules and how this is related to their identification strategy. It's very impressive in the sense that it combines very many data sets. It's a lot of work and the results are fairly consistent. I think compared to the previous literature, looks at some longer term outcomes. And it also discusses some mechanisms that were not always explored in previous studies. So I have just some comments, can take them as you want. So the first one is on the empirical strategy. So you use these very large birth cohorts between 1994 and 2004. And so of course, this is going to mean there can be change in behaviors of parents particularly. So one thing is that following the citizenship rules, actually the parental decision to stay in Germany or to leave might change, which means that you'll have different sample attrition. Then one other thing is that we are still considering 4 years before and after the reform. And actually, these can affect the marriage market. So the decision of an individual whether to marry an ethnic German or someone from abroad. And there is indeed this paper, I think it's at GP by Ada Pinotti and Tura, where they show that changes in the legal rules actually affect who individuals choose to marry in Italy. Of course, they have larger time windows, but you still have 4 years, so this can still happen. And then in a very similar argument, you can also say that this might affect strategic fertility because just the decision of having a child or the number of children that parents have, so this quality versus quantity trade-off might indeed be affected by the citizenship rules, and you note this in this Avitabil et al. Paper. But so it might mean that, yeah, there is something different about the parents and the kids born after the reform, also because let's say you might decide to have less children after the reform and now invest in quality. So this is one mechanism that later I come again, that the parents actually also put more effort in the child. And then you can have, because of these large cohorts, also some sort of exogenous differential trends in the returns to education or discrimination between treated and control groups. And so I have just very briefly, I think, some suggestions. I don't know how feasible they are to implement, but that, yeah, maybe you can check. So you can actually use the SUP to look at parents' return intentions pre and post reform in the SUP. You can also try to use the SUP to get some more information about parental pre-reform characteristics. So maybe those that don't really change across time, or even parents that you observe in the panel, both before and after. This just to show that really the sort of the set of parents before and after the reform has not changed. About this marital homogamy, you can also maybe use the microcentres and just show that the percentage of marriages where both spouses are non-foreign or non-EU citizen has not changed in pre-post reform. Then I think that it does not need to be your main specification, but has a robustness check. Having a more local difference in difference, or RDD, could be useful. So where you restrict to children born 1 to 6 months before and after the reform cutoff month. This can also be important because when you measure your outcomes, you are basically looking at children that are in the same grade in school, but just have different probabilities of being a German citizen. Because if they are born around this cutoff, they still might enter school in the same year, but some were subject to the policy, some others not. And these might also deal with these changes in behaviors in fertility and homogamy among parents, because it's unlikely they can change their decision within this short time period. And then maybe I misunderstood, but in the NEPS section, it did seem that you mentioned that 90% were born between 1999 and 2000, which makes it effectively closer. So also for consistency, you should ensure that you have a very similar sample based on cohorts across the 3 surveys. Then I think there are a bunch of placebos that you can do. So you can do a placebo treatment event where basically you restrict your sample to the pre-period and you just assume that the policy was implemented in a year prior to 1999, and we estimate your equation and do this multiple times and then plot the coefficients. You can also have some placebo treatment groups and control groups. So you could have like, say that treated are those with one citizen parent and the controls are those with two citizen parents. And you can also do a different treatment where you consider those that have foreign-born parents, but neither parent was complied with the citizenship rules. On the heterogeneous effects, I think that you should really try to explore more heterogeneous gains from citizenship. I know you show EU and non-EU, but you can still think that individuals from different countries of origin might be more or less prone to face discrimination by German natives. And so this will have differential gains from citizenship. And how you tackle the discrimination, who is more discriminated, you can use qualitative evidence, but you might also just actually go to the SAP and see which groups are more likely to report having experienced discrimination. And very similar individuals from countries with different gender norms or religious backgrounds might have different gains from citizenship because the distance to the German culture is much larger, so there can be more identity conflicts. And this might actually matter more for girls than for boys. And so this is also important. Okay, I'll try to go really quickly. So there is one study that you do not mention, which is this Dahl et al. Restart, which is called Between Cultures and Intended Consequences of Improving Opportunities for Immigrant Girls. They use the same report, but they have their own survey. They use this also closer to the cutoff birth dates, and they actually find that Muslim immigrant girls affected by the reform are less integrated into German society. They find no effect for immigrant girls from non-Muslim backgrounds, and they find that if anything, immigrant boys are more socially integrated. And at least in the paper, when you actually find the results for girls, it seemed to me that if anything they were strongly integrated than boys. So I really think that you need to compare both studies and why the results differ. And again, here, these heterogeneous effects by religious background and so on might also help you tackle this. Yeah, and then I will just finish here. I have some more comments, but I think basically also in the you mention all of these things throughout the paper, but then when you get to the point where you discuss the mechanism, you basically mention two. But you can think of that there are three stones. So one is that you have your own identity and self-perception as a child, and this might be complete potential also conflict in identity. And here, educational ambition, for me, it's not clear that it's a result of returns to education. It might be an identity thing. You have one that you discuss very little, which is actually parental investment in children. So this vertical transmission or influence of parents. And these you don't test, but also it doesn't seem that you actually mention it has a mechanism, even though you've talked about this somewhere in the paper. And then this third one is one where you discuss partially, where you discuss this market access, so the access to jobs, but then you also don't discuss sort of these other parts of this horizontal influence, which are the perception or discrimination by outsiders. Yeah, and so I think my idea is just that it's fine, you cannot test everything, but you're pushing too hard on these two mechanisms as if they were the only ones. And in reality, I think they are not. Yeah, and then I have some other minor things, but that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, Celina, feel free to react.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the extremely well organized and in-depth discussion. I really look forward to going through your comments a bit more in detail and trying to implement them. Let me try to answer to some of the points that you mentioned. So I think starting about the part about parents and how fertility and maybe also the selection changes. I think the issue with our setting is that it's going to be very hard to disentangle the cumulative effects of this reform. In a way, we're evaluating the reform, but the reform comes with different parts. Right? So it's a little bit the Kuna and Heckman idea that I said earlier, that if a parent is already investing a lot more into early childhood development, this can have long-lasting effects throughout the whole career. And you're absolutely right that this is a channel that we should probably emphasize a bit more. But in a way, we won't really be able to disentangle how much of this human capital gain is accruing in every single step of the way. We try to do that a bit, but it's very hard and difficult to measure, especially for early ages. But this vertical transmission, all points extremely well taken. I think you're right. We should be more precise. In terms of the marriage market, I think it is a fantastic suggestion to use the microcensus to actually show how the marriage market might have changed and the dynamics of which couples build after the reform might have changed. And also thank you for referring us to the paper that we'll look at on this topic about how the policies changed how people made. In terms of other parental characteristics, we have done a couple of checks on how the distribution of parental countries of origins and household income or where they live changes over time. The microcensus unfortunately has this issue that because of the structure and how we have just these 7 years of microcensus and who answers these questions, we have a change in the share of children who are still living with their parents, and for them we have disproportionately more information, which makes it very hard to compare over time the distribution of parents with respect to certain characteristics. But you did mention something very implementable, which is actually using the SUP to see how the distribution changes. And I think even though we have a lower sample there, we can definitely do that. So thanks again also for that. Right. Concerning the cohorts that we look at, you mentioned correctly that for the NEPs, we have somewhat different bandwidth around the reform that we use. In this case, it's actually quite technical because the NEPs is a longitudinal study, which looks at children who were enrolled in 5th grade in a given year and then follows them over time. So we cannot do much in terms of expanding that horizon. And actually, we think of the NEPs more as a complementary data set to give a bit more in detail results on the educational dimensions that we care about. In that sense, I don't think we can really approximate that.
Yeah, so my suggestion was the other way around, is that in your main one, you use just 1999, 2000. So it's that in your main results, you actually reduce the bandwidth. That would be more my suggestion.
Yeah.
So
okay, yeah, exactly. Yeah, we definitely will have a look at that as well, and varying the bandwidth there a bit. But I also, so this was one of your suggestions in terms of verifying the robustness of our findings. But I also liked your 2 suggestions on placebo tests, and especially also the one where we used alternative treatment and control groups. The other suggestion, maybe we can talk a bit more about it in detail. We have this issue that we do have only a gradual closure in the gap of actually having citizenship at birth in our data. So we don't have this very clear jump that we would love to have. So once we narrow the bandwidth very much there, we're basically not using all the part where the effect seems to, or where we're accurately sort of matching the treatment group. But we will think more about it, and this point has come up before. Finally, and I mean also not going into too much detail, but we have also done heterogeneity analysis with respect to gender and parental country of origin. We don't find anything in terms of gender. Maybe that's because we don't differentiate between gender and parental country of origin or gender and religion. But like the point estimate for that heterogeneity is essentially 0, and also quite precisely estimated. But we do find some differences in terms of country of origin, and that goes a bit in line with what I said earlier about the length of stay of parents. We do find that the effect is significantly larger for people who were, for example, born in Turkey and who tended to have already stayed in Germany for much longer. And we don't want to speculate too much, but potentially the fact that this reform is also a signal of integration, which has for a long time not been given by the country, is incentivizing that specific group to invest more into education. Yeah, I hope I addressed like the main points, but I'm happy to talk more, and I'd love to have your slides and potentially notes if you.
yeah, of course. I think maybe we open and then we can discuss in the end.
Excellent, perfect. Yes.
Okay. Are there any further questions from?
So me again. Thank you very much for the presentation, Celina. I was wondering, so now you're treated or the eligible second generation migrant, and I was wondering if it would be possible to look at those who at 23 are choosing the German nationality and not another one, and so like to try to see if these are the guys that like gain the most in terms of education or like that, or if it's quite random.
Great idea. Unfortunately for us, there was another law in 2014 which pretty much abolished the entire option requirement. So in fact, in the end, pretty much no child had to choose.
Okay, I see. Unlucky for you, but good for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do have another 2 slides on the institutional details of this reform and the preceding reforms, but yeah, it's a good idea. We would be able to learn a bit more about how the incentives maybe work versus this feeling of sort of acceptance, maybe. Even though I do take Teresa's point that there's maybe more than these 2 channels.
I have a question. Do you have any way of exploring whether this, because like the reform involves a lot of steps, right? Or a lot of parts. Like you mentioned that one part of it is that you're not forced to hold the German citizenship exclusively, right? I wonder if you have any way of disentangling the effect of that, of isolating the effect of only that part of the reform.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't done this. I could imagine that there is a way because there were some very specific cases in which you could not abolish your own nationality. I don't want to lie. I think there's very few countries, but I think it's Iran or maybe like 2 or 3 other countries where you're actually not allowed to stop being a citizen once you are one. So those were differentially affected by the second dimension of the reform, so this option requirement. So looking at heterogeneities there may help us to gain an understanding of how much this part mattered. But yeah, that's a good point. Thank you very much.